Yeah, I'm going to talk to you today about collecting world art at the Andersonian Museum between 1830 and 1889. Throughout much of the 19th century, the Hunterian was one of two university museums in Glasgow, both of which exhibited collections of world art as vehicles for culturally describing the wider world that Glaswegians were increasingly encountering. Little has been written about the Andersonian Museum at Anderson's University in the Merchant City, which became today's University of Strathclyde. And even less research has addressed the museum's ethnological collection, quote unquote, as the Andersonian's curators defined what we would today call their world art collection. This collection was transferred to the Hunterian when the Andersonian Museum closed in 1889. And this remarkable gift was the largest single donation that the Hunterian's world art collection has ever received. So the Andersonian collection is certainly worth considering in some depth. Today, I'm going to discuss some interim findings about the Andersonian's world art collection. Like several Hunterian curators before me, I've been researching the Andersonian gift this summer, and although there are significant documentation challenges to understanding the museum retrospectively, there are several interesting donations to be considered, reflecting the fact that Anderson's University and the Andersonian Museum were embedded in a somewhat different context of 19th century Glasgow's colonial entanglements and global economic relationships to that we find at the Hunterian. And so the Andersonian Museum I am fascinated by, and it falls into that strange category of ghost museums, museums that no longer exist anymore, have no physical trace, but played an important role in the history of collections in Britain. And there are a number of other examples of museums like this, famously the Victorian Museum, Bullock's Egyptian Hall, and so on and so forth, the Museum of Freddie Arnhem and various others. So it's a strange and interesting topic, museums that no longer exist. Oh, that doesn't seem to be working. I'm wondering why my PowerPoint's not working. Oh, there we go. It's just very slow. Right, sorry about that. So, there are actually very few meaningful sources to consult when we do research on the Andersonian Museum. The University of Strathclyde cares for this extremely fine 1831 watercolour of the museum's interior by John Alexander Gilfillan, who taught painting and draftsmanship at the Andersonian University between 1830 and 1842. Several items of world art and natural history are easily recognizable in Gilfillan's painting, which are still in the Hunterian collection today. And that includes what you can see here on the right-hand side. These a very large set of Austral Islands engraved paddles that we have in the Hunterian collection now. You can see a number of those there. A large number of Maori taiaha from New Zealand. These pole clubs here, there's a number of those there. There's a Maori tefa tefa. Another kind of war club, and as you can see, various South American bows and arrows and so on. There's a Turkish water pipe there, and there's a number of Buddhas in this case here, which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, as well as various taxidermied birds and mammals and reptiles and so on. We also have exterior photographs of the George Street facade, giving some idea of the college building housing the museum. That's what you can see top right there. But it was physically demolished by the Glasgow and West of Scotland Technical College in 1906, as Anderson's University was renamed at the time. So the University of Strathclyde is the third name that the institution has had. The site's been rebuilt upon, so there is no physical trace. Secondary sources disagree even about the museum's opening date, and the founder, Professor John Anderson's 1796 death, bequeathed a collection of philosophical apparatus and minerals to the eponymous institution, outlined and funded by his will. However, this stock of equipment and these geological specimens were only used for teaching students enrolled on those specific courses by lecturers in their teaching rooms, and they were neither publicly accessible or even accessible to the Andersonian University's other students. So not really a museum at that point. So although you will read earlier dates mentioned, it was actually in 1828 when the managers of Anderson's University passed a resolution to establish a general public museum at the university. And over the next 3 years, several professors, current students, alumni, and local businessmen made a wide range of donations to the collection. The domed gallery, illustrated in Gilfilm's watercolour, was completed in 1830 and opened to the public in 1831. And the first of 2 short printed guides to the museum was published. Now, one of the most useful features of the 1831 account of the Andersonian Museum, which is what you can see on the left there, is an extensive alphabetical list of donors to the founding collection, which is what you can see in the middle, which occasionally describes the type and geographical origin of their donations. It's often quite confusing, this list of donors and donations, because it'll say, for example, Indian curiosities, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, and it's impossible to know whether Indian curiosities means, in this context, in the early 19th century in Glasgow, India, or any part of the Americas, or even parts of the South Pacific. People were talking about the Indies and Indians in an extremely vague way in this period in Britain. So there's an awful lot of interpretation that needs to be done coming from these lists. So unfortunately, the second printed Andersonian guide of 1865, the catalogue of the museum that you can see on the right there, dispensed entirely with this donor list, which was the most useful part of the 1831 guide. Although it does add a few names, while later donations of the period 1831 to 1865 were particularly notable or extensive. However, the later guide is more useful for conveying a sense of how the Andersonian curators conceptualized their quote-unquote ethnological collections and what they viewed as the purpose of displaying them. The minutes of the quarterly meetings of the Board of Trustees of Anderson's University occasionally mention specific donations made to the museum, but more often than not, these minutes read, quote, "The list of donations to the Andersonian Museum and Library was read from the separate record of donations, and the donors were thanked." This record of donations would undoubtedly explain a huge amount about the Andersonian collection, but it no longer exists, either at the University of Strathclyde or here at the University of Glasgow. And whether it's transferred to the Hunterian in 1889 with the collection is unknown, but if it was, then it's been lost since then. So it seems that any retrospective reconstruction of the story of the Andersonians' world art collections is inevitably going to be fragmentary. So Professor John Anderson, that's him there on the left, was himself a natural scientist based at the University of Glasgow, and one of the major Glasgow-based figures of the so-called Scottish Enlightenment. At the end of his life, however, he viewed the 18th century University of Glasgow as elitist, insular, and snobbish, disconnected from the common working men and women, uninvested in the science, industry, craft, and commerce that were defining the development of Glasgow as the Industrial Revolution took hold. These concerns defined the range of scientific, industrial, artistic, and commercial subjects taught at Anderson's University, as well as its different approach to enrolment, to fees, to evening and weekend courses for working people, to lifelong learning and the education of women, setting a democratic agenda for technical colleges all over the world. So to ensure that Anderson's University continued to abide by these principles, one of the distinctive characteristics of its early history is the prominent involvement of the Anderson family of Greenock themselves in the university's governance, both as one constituency of the Board of Trustees overseeing institutional decisions, and you can see that here on this list of trustees, the bottom right there, you can see kinsmen and namesakes is one class of trustees and various members of John Anderson's extended family, but also as donors to the Andersonian Museum. And there are, I think, 6 members of the Anderson family listed in the 1831 guide as donors to the museum, but 4 of them as donors of world art. And these figures, these men, are primarily John Anderson's nephews, the children of his younger brother, Andrew Anderson of Kilblane House in Greenock. I couldn't find a picture of Andrew Anderson, but there's a picture of the house at least. And as you can see, great big old pile. A very wealthy, successful merchant who was a close friend of James Watt. So here, two of Anderson's nephews are particularly interesting. Dr. William Stewart Anderson, you can see them, they're both in the red box here on top left. Dr. William Stewart Anderson, 1787 to 1845, and his younger brother, Thomas Anderson, 1797 to 1855. Both of them are credited with having donated Indian curiosities before 1831. So throughout the 1820s and early 1830s, Thomas Anderson was an East India merchant based in Calcutta, junior partner of the prominent British trading firm Colvins and Company. And you can see there, bottom left, the tomb of one prominent member of the Colvin family, John Russell Colvin, whose tomb, as you can see, is actually inside the Red Fort of Agra in Uttar Pradesh, alongside a number of Mughal emperors. So the business went bust. Colvins and Company went bust in 1834. Thomas returned to Britain, using his connections to set up an East India import-export business in Liverpool. Now, because the record of donations has been lost, we have no clear idea what Thomas donated to the Andersonian, but with his older brother, William Stewart, we're in a better position. And before I move on from that, I just want to mention, if you look at the name John Anderson Esquire, a namesake of Professor John Anderson, immediately above the red box there, it says, from Calcutta, John Anderson sending 16 skins of animals from New South Wales. So it's quite interesting, you know, you can see that there are many things from parts as distant as Australia being traded through British India at this time. But also, you know, you need to understand that various members of the Anderson family are active in South Asia at this time, not just Thomas and William Stewart. So, William Stewart Anderson studied medicine here at the University of Glasgow, graduating in 1806, aged 19, and joined the British East India Company's army as a company surgeon. So the monumental inscription on the Anderson family's communal tomb at Inverkip Cemetery in Greenock recalls that William served in two colonial wars: the Third Anglo-Maratha War of 1817 to 1818, which more than any other conflict consolidated British control of the Indian subcontinent. And that's what you can see there in that map from 1823 on the left there. This is one of the few times where we can positively match Andersonian collections objects to a named donor, because this large collection, oh, sorry, I missed a bit there. Subsequently, he also fought in the First Anglo-Burmese War of 1824 to 1826, and that's what you can see in the map, bottom centre, the expansion of British control into what's now Bangladesh and most of Western Burma or Myanmar. This is one of the few times where we can positively match Andersonian collection objects to a named donor, because this large collection of gilt, marble, wood and silver Buddhist images from Myanmar still retain their original handwritten labels from their display in the Andersonian, and indeed we can see some of these statuettes on display in Gilfilm's watercolour, which is what you can see top centre there. So what really isn't clear, and this is something you come across again and again and again in trying to deal with the Andersonian collection, is the circumstances under which William Stewart Anderson collected these sculptures. Obviously, the contemporary temptation, him being a military surgeon, is to assume that they must be military loot of some kind. However, William Anderson was a university-educated man, the grandson of a prominent Presbyterian minister, and lived in South Asia for 2 decades. So these relatively small images are of exactly the kind of maidens sold for domestic shrines throughout the Buddhist world. So it is perfectly possible that he bought them at market, but we simply can't tell. And that's the issue. Now, one thing that Professor Nick Pierce in History of Art has brought to my attention, however, is that these are among the earliest works of Burmese art to be found in any UK museum collection. So we have a lot more work to do to understand the activities and biographies of various members of the Anderson family in South Asia before we can accurately measure the significance of the Andersonians' Asian collection overall. But these early 19th century military and commercial connections are actually much clearer and more concrete than those that we have for similar items in the Hunterian's own collection. So moving on to another case study. It's almost certainly true that the person primarily responsible for defining the Andersonian Museum's curatorial orientation to its world art collections was John Schuyler, Professor of Natural History at Anderson's University. It was Schuyler who imposed a Linnaean scientific organization on the biological collections of the Andersonian, and who equally took some kind of organized scholarly approach to the material culture. It's also fair to say that after Schuyler passed on in 1871, enthusiasm at Anderson's University for maintaining the museum rapidly waned, and this ultimately sealed the fate of the Andersonian Museum and occasioned its transfer to the Hunterian in 1889. Schuyler was another medical doctor and anatomist trained at the University of Glasgow, with postgraduate experience in botany and zoology gained in Paris. When he was 20 years old in 1824, he served for 2 years as ship's doctor and naturalist on a Hudson's Bay Company ship, the William and Anne, which sailed up the Pacific Northwest coast of North America, trading for furs. Schuyler wrote some of the earliest cultural descriptions of Native American and Canadian First Nations peoples of the Pacific Northwest coast, and particularly the Columbia River area, in what are now the American states of Washington, Oregon, and also the Canadian province of British Columbia. So, during his time on the Pacific Northwest coast, Schuyler traded extensively with local people and accumulated a significant collection of Chinook, Haida, and other Native American and Canadian First Nations material culture, which he subsequently donated to the Andersonian Museum. So Schuyler's reason for making such a collection are explained clearly in the 1865 catalogue of the Andersonian, in which he wrote of the museum's display of specimens of dresses and implements of savage races and tribes classified according to their ethnological provinces. As many Aboriginal tribes have already become extinct or are rapidly disappearing, the products of their industry can no longer be procured or replaced when lost. The utmost care has been taken to indicate the tribe to which each specimen belonged and the country it inhabited, and you'll notice that he's speaking there in the past tense. So this view that all indigenous societies beyond Europe were dwindling away to nothing is one of the clearest expressions that I've ever read of what anthropologists and historians nowadays call the doomed race hypothesis, which was invoked all over the world by Europeans. This view is usually expressed at some point in the 18th or 19th centuries in reference to all regions that the Europeans were colonizing, and it can be directly linked to the colonial notion that Europeans were fulfilling their manifest destiny to conquer the world and replace its existing populations. So John Schuyler, a bit of a scumbag in my view. There we go. Given this mindset, you perhaps won't be surprised to hear that Schuyler was also an active collector of human skulls and a practitioner of craniometry. That's the measurement of skulls for making inferences about anthropology, like many other 19th century anatomists. So while Schuyler was on the Pacific Northwest coast, he robbed several Native American graves to collect both human skulls and also mummified children, and he barely escaped alive when he was discovered doing this. When he died in 1871, his will stipulated that those remains gathered on the Pacific Northwest coast should be transferred to the Natural History Museum in Paris, where he studied as a postgraduate, as I mentioned. However, under Schuyler's curatorial stewardship, by 1865, the Andersonian Museum had accumulated a display of more than 50 racially classified human skulls from all over the world. And that's what you can see described here in the 1865 catalogue. It now seems certain that at least some of these skulls were transferred to the Hunterian in 1889 alongside the ethnological material culture, and that they came to form an integral part of the Hunterian Anatomy Museum's collection of crania that were arranged, displayed and catalogued by John Cleland in 1909. Moving on again, one of the central problems of collections history that I've been struggling with at the Hunterian over the last 5 years has been comprehending the problematic nature of the Hunterian's ethnography register, which is what you can see top left there. On face value, this book appears to be an ordinary museum catalogue of our world art collection, compiled around the year 1900 initially, with a simple running number system, E1, E2, and so on, E standing for ethnography, along regional lines. It then appears that material was systematically catalogued each year from 1900 onwards with a running number in each year. So you get accession numbers of the structure E1911.1, for example, then E1911.2 for the next thing accessioned in 1911, and so on and so forth. So it all looks like a very organized system, yes, and it looks like we were entirely in control of everything that was in the museum from 1900 onwards, and this is not what actually happened at all. So in actuality, the ethnography register was compiled between 1943 and 1945 at the end of the Second World War by Professor Anne Robertson, who you can see there top right, the principal excavator of numerous Roman sites along the Antonine Wall. And she did this, she catalogued the entire ethnography collection and the rest of the archaeology collection as well during the Second World War, because the Department of Works wouldn't give her any men to go and dig trenches on the Antonine Wall, so she sat in the museum during the Second World War instead and catalogued the collection. Now, in producing this register 140 years after the Hunterian actually opened, Professor Robertson did a number of very unorthodox things. On several occasions, she assumed that material culture items coming from the same country, sometimes even from the same continental region, all came from the same donor, for no clear reason, only to make things simple for herself at the time. And equally, vice versa, she also assumed that things from the same donor all came from the same country. And this is the direct cause for many of the major problems that the Hunterians had with identifying provenances for its Pacific collection and its African collections over the last 80 years. And those are misattributions that we're still in the process of correcting now. It also turns out, in relation to the Andersonian Museum, that another problematic thing Professor Robertson did at the same time was to appropriate donations that were actually made to the Andersonian Museum and falsely enter them into the Hunterian's ethnography register as if they had been made directly to the Hunterian instead. And now a prime example of this is the donation made to the Andersonian before 1831 by William Liddell, a collection of First Nations, Acadian and Inuit material culture from the coasts of eastern Canada, from Nova Scotia all the way up to the Davis Strait between Baffin Island in Nunavut and Greenland. And what you can see on the bottom of this slide is William Liddell's donation. It's the start of William Liddell's donation, recorded in the Hunterian's ethnography register after 1945, or just before 1945 rather, when actually it was donated to the Andersonian Museum 115 years earlier. The three brothers, Andrew Liddell, William Liddell, and John Liddell, were originally from Falkirk, but moved to Glasgow and set up in business in the merchant city during the 1780s. They operated a transatlantic shipping business between Glasgow and Nova Scotia, which you can see bottom left on the left-hand map there, in yellow, that's Nova Scotia. For much of the next 50 years, exporting manufactured goods to the growing British settlements of Halifax and Pictou. Now, they would also bring back timber and coal from Canada for Scotland. So Pictou was the principal Scottish settlement in Nova Scotia. And as you can see, there's New Glasgow there as well, the north coast of Nova Scotia, very close to Pictou. So, William Liddell, with his childhood friend, also from Falkirk, George Smith, who became influential in the government of Nova Scotia, subsequently established coal mining in Nova Scotia at Pictou between 1825 and 1828, before Liddell returned to Glasgow to manage the Scottish end of the family business. They also had fleets of fishing boats in the North Atlantic that were supplying fish to both Nova Scotia and to Scotland. And William's brother, John Liddell, settled at Halifax, and Liddell Brothers ran a coastal merchant and passenger shipping network up the east coast of Canada into the far north. So, the items that William Liddell donated to the Andersonian no doubt provided many Glaswegians with their first impressions of Canadian First Nations culture and art before they migrated to Nova Scotia and beyond. In producing many geologists and engineers, merchants, medics, and agriculturalists, the graduates of Anderson's University played a significant role in the Scots colonial story of North America, as well as in driving Glasgow's central role in 19th century Britain's transatlantic trade networks with Canada and the USA. So, although there are many more stories to reconstruct and flesh out with research, I don't really have any more time to discuss them today. What I hope to have given you is a brief taste of the Andersonian Museum as a rich and historically complex institution containing fascinating collections, but equally beset by the same problems of colonial legacies that all world art collections face in the 21st century. Further work needs to be done to ask some difficult questions about the particular legacies of John Schuyler, not only as a naturalist, as he has been considered before, but also as a grave robber, a collector of human skulls, and an exponent of social evolutionism. Considering the Andersonian Museum more broadly, because it sat at the heart of the merchant city in both a literal geographical sense and in the sense of Anderson's university's socioeconomic networks, the Andersonian was arguably more closely connected to the civic life of the city than the Victorian Hunterian was. The majority of the museum's early donors seem to have had their homes and their businesses within that square half-mile west of Glasgow Green and north of the river. Consequently, looking into the Andersonian's world art collections strongly reflects the city's colonial trade links in Asia, in Canada, in Guyana, in South America, and elsewhere. So, in terms of our better understanding the Hunterian's own history, it's now evident that the Andersonian's world art collection was significantly larger even than the Hunterian's documentation shows it to be, and that several donations listed in our documentation during the 1940s were actually gifts to the Andersonian, in several cases more than 115 years earlier. So, lots more work to be done on this subject, but the promise of interesting histories to emerge from it. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. That was wonderful. Yeah, if anyone's got any questions, you can pop them in the chat. There is a question in here, Andy, which I'll read out from Ava Jane, which says, has any effort been made to return the skulls and remains to the area and people from which they were taken from?
Well, I think that's a very good question. I think the Natural History Museum, when we're talking about the skulls from the Columbia River that Schuyler stole, they were transferred to the Natural History Museum in Paris when he died in 1871. So that is a matter for the Natural History Museum in Paris to address clearly. Now, in terms of our own collections, which are extremely problematic, and Elaine and I were just actually talking about this before we came on this session today. You know, we have both in our Anatomy Museum collection, but also in our World Art collection, which, as it was previously known, the ethnography collection. We have human remains from a wide variety of different countries, and we are actively pursuing the repatriation and reburial of people from several different countries. We have processes in place at the moment in various stages of maturity to return human remains to Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Ireland, and also the USA as well. We have other human remains to return to many, many different countries. And this kind of work is going to take us undoubtedly decades to undo. The accumulation of human skulls in Western museum collections was a work of decades, and it will take decades to undo as well. But we are very actively involved in doing that now, I guess. Thank you for asking the question, Eva.
Thanks, Andy. You've just touched on, repatriation, but I just wondered where else do you take this research from here, and kind of, what's next in your work around the Andersonian collection?
Yeah, well, it's a very challenging museum to try and understand because, as I say, it's gone, it's physically gone, but also the documentation that we have is very fragmentary. This list of donors from 1831 is a real gold mine in some ways in terms of understanding the networks, the social, the actor networks of accumulation that went on in that period. But it's one of the most interesting things about the Andersonian as a museum is that its donors are, unlike the Hunterian's donors, who are, dons and alumni, arts and humanities graduates and so on and so forth, and medical students coming from various parts of the British Empire and that kind of thing. What you get with the Andersonian is you get merchants and you get manufacturers who are based in Glasgow, who have themselves international, intercontinental networks of trade, and they are accumulating material that relates to their industries. And this is the interesting things that you see in the Andersonian, silk weavers and merchants who are donating Chinese textiles, like these beautiful shoes that you can see in the middle of this slide, but also you're seeing distillers, makers of rum and whiskey who are using sugar, and they're importing sugar in large quantities from Demerara, from Guyana, and they are donating things like these blow dart quivers of the kind that you can see here, which is I'm an absolute sucker for a curare tipped blow dart, and I always have been. So I just I love using them in slideshows. I think they're amazing. I mean, this basketry blow dart quiver is just a beautiful thing, really, really wonderful. But also, I think you see a lot of those commercial links that aren't so obvious in the Hunterian, but are very, very much a part of Glasgow's history. The Hudson's Bay Company, the Greenland whale fishery, and those major industries that Glaswegians played a leading role in, throughout the 18th, 19th centuries, and that's reflected very directly in those collections. And so it's an interesting and it's a distinctive story, and it's a particular kind of museum, which reflects a different side of Glasgow to the Hunterian, I think. And we are extremely fortunate to have been given this gift, and particularly since John Anderson had such a jaded view of the University of Glasgow by the time he died. I'm not sure how pleased he would have been to have the collection of the museum coming to the University of Glasgow, but we are very grateful for it, and greatly privileged to have it, and I think we need to do more with it, more to understand it, definitely. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, very much so. Thank you, Andy. I think we've got time for one more question before I have to shoot off for a workshop. There's a question in here in the chat from Kevin, which says, were some of the items in the collection examples of things being traded at the time?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, I think that there are things that are being donated by people who have never been anywhere other than Scotland, but they're donating things that have come from, very remote parts of the world. Um, Equally, there is material that's being donated from people who were traveling all over the world as well. And I think, this is very much what you get. And you could absolutely, as I do myself now, you could accumulate a collection of things from all over the world, anywhere in the world now, because we are in an entirely globalized world. So all of these kinds of things are being traded still, and they have been for centuries. Absolutely, many of these things are being traded. If you mean, are they forms of tourist art? Some of them definitely are. I mean, the Austral Islands paddles that I showed earlier. They're one of our earliest forms of known souvenirs, these here bottom right on this slide. They're one of the earliest known forms of souvenirs that they date from 1820 to 1840. The vast majority of them were made from the Austral Islands, which is a place that, no disrespect to the Austral Islands, 99% of the population of the world couldn't find on a map. But they are all over the world's museums, these paddles, because they were all made for export. We should absolutely not presume that things weren't being traded aggressively, by indigenous people all over the world, and particularly in the Pacific, many items of material culture were already being traded, through local networks, and that's equally true in Africa, that's equally true in South America and North America as well. So absolutely, things were being made for trade. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you again, Andy, for such a great talk. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope that you all enjoyed it and have learned something new.